Hello, hello. Step one. Here we go, day one. Um, I know there's a lot kind of going on. And just so you know, I think we're all figuring this out right now, you guys and us included. And for the most part, it's trying to maintain some sense of normalcy and at the same time of understanding it's not normal. So it's kind of a mixed bag there of understanding what's going on and at the same time trying to keep things kind of smooth as best as we can. One of my big goals is, again, kind of a mixed bag, is not going to try and go crazy here. There'll definitely be adjustments to our normal routine. But at the same time, you guys have worked so hard this year, and we are so close to the end that I really want to get you guys there so that this year was worth it and you didn't feel like it was a waste because of the last however so many weeks. Okay, so my plan today is I was just going to kind of briefly look at some of the things we talked about when I last saw you on Thursday. Which is kind of typical of what we would have done anyway. And then I'll go over the slides that we didn't get to. And then tomorrow will be a kind of review on your own day. And I'm going to send you a study guide, and the test will be on Wednesday. And I can explain more about that. But just so you know that you're gonna get a calendar here from me. Just communicate with me as much as you can during this process if you have any questions or concerns. And I understand that it's very easy for you to want to just sleep and relax. But at the same time, I want to make this worth it. Okay, this is actually, I think, one of the most interesting time periods. It's the modern stuff, the stuff that is usually the students are most interested in, the last two periods. So I want you to fight against that. There's going to be a lot of independent work, motivating yourself, call your friend, FaceTime, study with them, that kind of thing. All right. Okay. So just kind of quick, I'm just going to go through some of the stuff we talked about on Thursday, but really it's largely up to you to kind of look at that and remember. But in general, we left off with World War II ending, right? And the Cold War now kind of coming out of that. So we looked at, let me move my face from Stalin, not associate myself with Stalin. We looked at the Yalta Conference, and that was at the end of the World War II, right? And trying to figure out what are we going to do with Germany. We'll elaborate on that in a little bit. But really, this is kind of the compromise, remember, of what are we going to do with Germany. And Stalin agreed to have free elections, which falls apart because he wants safety for communism. And then Japan, and we're going to get more Japan here in a minute. And so Bretton Woods that was the monetary currency exchange to try and keep the economy. One of the big ideas of this whole chapter is how do we not fall into a Great Depression and an international recession because of that war, right? So they're trying to do things differently this time. And then, so this goes the same thing as United Nations coming out of that instead of the falling apart of the League of Nations. And then we talked about the Nuremberg trials and what they did with the Nazi soldiers, the leaders, really. So we talked about that. But yeah, this is where we looked at this map and how they divided Germany into 4 different parts with the goal of hopefully unifying them one day when they become stable. But someone disagreed with that, and that was Stalin over here in East Germany. My British accent again. There has descended upon the continent an iron curtain. I think that was better. That was pretty good. anyway, and so just remember that Iron Curtain, that metaphor, not a real curtain, of you got the communist sides over here, and a lot of them don't have a choice because Russia or the Soviet Union is controlling them, versus over here, and you've got all the democratic countries. And then remember Stalin enacted a Berlin blockade that hopefully he thought the Allies would give up, even though he was an ally. The democratic countries would give up and just give him Berlin, but it didn't work, right? Because they were dropping milk bottles on them. Okay, just kidding. Cool. And then we talked about what is America going to do now, right? They say they're against communism, but are they actually going to fight it? So they have this philosophy of containment, right? Let's contain communism and not let it spread because communism wants to spread. And then you have the Truman Doctrine here, where you've got countries who are, supporting democratic movements and trying to fight against communism. Truman will give them money, right? So that is specifically aimed at fighting communism. It's an economic, okay? But then you kind of have, the Marshall Plan is a little bit less, it's economic, but it's not quite as intentional of fighting communism, even though it does. The Marshall Plan says that the United States is going to give all this money to European countries to help them rebuild their economy, because they know that now, after making the mistake first round, that if Europe's economy can improve, right, and rebuild, then America's trade and international kind of economy in general will thrive. But you see how that kind of goes against communism as well. It's not quite as specific as the Truman Doctrine to fight communism, but in the end, it's still fighting communism. So another kind of thing that comes up is recognizing Israel, right? And kind of all the backlash that's going to come from that. NSA, we talked about what department is now formed, Department of Defense, and you've got the Army and Navy, all those underneath it. And the CIA is going to come out of this, all in response to, yes, we're in peacetime, but we realize that we're in a interesting situation with the Cold War. Okay, and so NATO, do you remember what NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this is our peacetime alliance, right? That usually we stay away from peacetime alliances, but we feel pretty strongly that we're going to need it. Fun fact, Russia is going to make a peacetime alliance as well. Can you imagine with who? All the satellite countries that they control. So is it an alliance? I don't know. And then you get tons of political cartoons, which we were going to do something with, but virtual. Okay. Okay, this is where we left off. So that's kind of, we talked about how we are dealing with Europe and Germany specifically. Well, now, what about the Pacific and Japan specifically? Essentially, we recommended, that's a nice word for saying demanded, in our kind of treaty to end the war, was that Japan had to accept democratic processes. There you go. And remember, they did keep Emperor Hirohito on the throne, but that was symbolic. So they had to have all these kind of elections, and Japan is actually going to jump on board pretty quickly with this. And that's going to be a huge success for the United States and the Allies, because what comes out of all that democracy, Japan actually does really well. As you know today, they are, economic power, they're up in that economic powerhouse level with everyone else. So kind of shows you a success story of democracy there. However, kind of right next door, in China, America during the World War II was supporting, so I would go into detail, but we don't need to know a ton of detail right now. Basically, they were having their own civil war. Okay, they're having nationalists versus the communists. The nationalists, the United States supported. Jiang Jiechi was their leader. And they ended up having kind of a lot of corruption, so a lot of people didn't support them in their own country. And what's going to happen is they kind of get forced out, actually, to Taiwan. And if you see this picture down here, the new leader of China is going to rise up. Who is he? Mao Zedong. And communism, and that's when communism takes hold of China, which still is largely around today. We can get into more modern Chinese economy, government later, but this is now, that's a huge loss for America, right? In Western Europe, because now you have this, although you got Japan on your side, kind of as a democracy, now you just lost China. And that's gonna play a major role moving forward. Kind of another thing that's happening during this little Cold War. So we, obviously, you know this, dropped the atomic bomb at the end of the war in 1945. Well, a couple years later, in 1949, the Soviet Union is going to test their atomic bomb. Boom! Our arch enemy right now has now exploded an atomic bomb as well. So they are equal to us in military force, which scares America because they were the top dog. And so now our government in Truman basically gives support to develop the H-bomb. And the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, is so much more powerful than the atomic bomb, which is pretty scary, right? And so I think we tested that in 1952. And guess what happens in 1953? The Soviet Union tests theirs. So it's a scary kind of buildup here of arms, of weapons, that really could, we talked about this in class, could destroy the whole world. So we'll kind of get to that again later. But there we go. Now, Korea. So, move that over there. Okay, so we know that Japan surrendered, and one of the things that Japan had to surrender was Korea. And you've got multiple people interested in Korea, right? Multiple groups. And what ends up happening is basically the Soviet Union kind of gets control of North Korea, while the United States gets control of South Korea. And this is very similar to like Germany, right? Of dividing it up, and maybe one day we can reunite and all be friends. And as you know, modern day, that's not happening. I'm going to give you these dates better. There we go. Okay. So they are right at the 38th parallel right here. Okay, that's kind of a little number to know. It's like your Missouri Compromise parallel. But this is where they divide it, okay? And so you've got kind of North Korea up here and South Korea down there. One's supported by America and one's supported by the Soviet Union. Okay, well, this is what happens in 1950, right up here. The North Koreans, using Soviet tanks, okay? So obviously there's support there from the Soviet Union, decides to cross this parallel and invade South Korea. And pretty quickly, really in a couple of weeks, they push South Korea all the way where there's not much left here of South Korea holding on. At this point, what does America do? If they get involved, they are now essentially in another war, right? Pretty soon after World War II just ended. So you've got this mindset of, okay, do we isolate ourselves? Think about World War I, World War II, what happens when you isolate, right? Or do we get involved now and back up our containment strategy? So they decide to, with the United Nations, really, because you think about the purpose of the United Nations is to what? Right? Help with one of the goals is world peace. And this is an aggressive act. And if you think about World War II and all those aggressive acts, right, and appeasement, and they let it happen. So they decide to, with the United Nations, they decide to kind of fight back and send forces. So the National Security Council memorandum here is just basically mobilizing troops now in America. They're going to train soldiers, and they're going to send them over. And so the UN does send a force over. It's largely made up of American soldiers. So an American general will lead it. Who will lead it? What general do we know in the Pacific that led it in World War II? MacArthur, right? Kind of the he's done a lot, but he's also a little bit crazy. Anyway, so he's kind of in charge, and if you look, okay, down here, so this is November, basically they send a force in, really here, behind enemy lines, and eventually, if you look at all this green, they're able to push, it's a very successful attack, all the way up. But look what happens, they get close to the Chinese border. Okay, so now you're basically waking up another dog, because you have Soviet tanks, right, in support. You've got North Koreans, and then now you've got Chinese are saying that's too close. And so now Chinese volunteers are going to now support North Korea and push back. Okay, why would China do that? The whole idea of communism is that you want it to spread, right? And you don't want any threat to your government system. And they figured if America got a kind of foothold over here, that maybe that would lead to the downfall of communism somehow. And so if you look, I just wanted to point out kind of these years, 1950 to 1953. By 1953, so Chinese forces had helped push it back. Look where they are again. Dun, 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 then 38th parallel. And I talked about that. At this point, MacArthur kind of goes haywire and says, we need to launch a nuclear weapon on China. We need to embargo them, essentially declaring war on China. Well, Truman basically says, we do not need another mass war right now / ever. And so he ends up firing MacArthur, and that's it's a big hot topic at that time. But they really are fighting for multiple years when they can't come up with this truce. And so it goes on until 1953 when they finally do declare a truce. And guess what happens? What's the truce? Let's declare that North Korea is above the 38th and South Korea is below the 38th. So exactly how it was before the war started, which is pretty depressing. You think about how many people died for this. No death is worth any advancement here, but I take that back. Well, it's more complicated, basically. My point is that all that happened really for no gain for anyone, which is pretty sad. So the Korean War is kind of a sad story in that sense. Okay. A couple years ago, well, let me ask you this first. What do you remember about the first Red Scare? Hopefully you think about, I don't know, I'm pausing like you're actually there, but you think about, so after World War I, right, and the Bolsheviks rising in Russia, you've got kind of the anti-unions, right, the American plan, you've got the Palmer raids, you've got the Sacco and Vanzetti case, if you remember that, right, where those Italians, immigrants, were sentenced to murder or to death. You've got the quotas that came out of that, right? Remember the quotas and the immigration laws and the KKK, right? And all the racism associated with immigration. So that's the first Red Scare. Well, a couple years ago, one of the, I think it was an LEQ on the AP test, it asked, what is the difference between the first Red Scare and the second Red Scare? It was a similarities and differences question. So you had to talk about similarities and differences. So let's talk about the second Red Scare, which happens after the Second World War. Okay. essentially, it's kind of very similar in the reasons, but you've got USSR now rising up. And then you've got even China and the Korean War. I mean, you have all these things happening. So domestically in America, what's life going to look like with this? First, the Attorney General is going to start this loyalty program, and he's going to investigate 3 million employees and see if they are loyal to capitalism or if there is communism. And because of that, 3,000, I think, people resigned out of their jobs. And if you think about it, even now today, do we have people who believe in communism in America? Yeah, we do. And does that mean they lose their job and, maybe go to jail today? No, unless there's things that they could do that could lead to that. But anyway, that's the loyalty program. And another thing kind of in that same time period is the House of Un-American Activities Committee. Isn't that funny? Un-American. And essentially, this is a House committee who's going to look into, they're going to look into senators, like people in the government. They're going to look into people in society. Going to look, like Hollywood's going to get looked into for communists, essentially, because that's un-American. And who gets his rise through this is this guy on the right, Richard Nixon. Spoiler alert, he becomes president later. He kind of has an interesting path that we'll talk about later, but this is kind of where he gets his start. And he gets famous with looking into Alger Hiss, and essentially he's a State Department employee, Alger Hiss is. And it's kind of this really public trial where eventually Hiss is found of lying and perjury and not showing all the documents, and so he does go to prison. The State Department, if you think about today, a State Department employee under that much speculation, right, and then going to prison for 5 years, it's a big deal. Another famous case are the Rosenbergs. And they were actually electrocuted, or put in the electric chair, because they were found to be giving the Soviet secrets for the atomic bomb. And there's a lot of controversy about this because they had kids, right? And especially kind of the idea of electrocuting a woman that has kids. And anyway, so that became a very public trial as well. In general, though, this is just all going to kind of spiral, and I would argue, I would argue that it was bigger than the first Red Scare. I think the idea, though, it's more public. It's even more public and in all different realms, not just like government and businesses. But anyway, Joseph McCarthy is going to get super famous here. So he's a senator from Wisconsin. And he basically gets famous for calling out people that are communists. And originally he says there's like 200 and something people in the government, like senators and House representatives, Congress people that are communists. And then they ask him who, give me these names. And he doesn't come up with any specifics, but he says, never mind, there's only like 57 of them, but he still doesn't name them. But the fact is, though, that they kind of let him keep going with these accusations. And because of that, nobody kind of stopped him until later on. That's kind of the effect of the scare at that point. And the government and the economy. But really, he keeps going with calling out people and people losing their jobs until he goes after the army and says there's a lot of people in the army in leadership positions that are also communists and could end up destroying us. So he calls for these hearings, and here's the thing about them, they're televised, and I was going to show you a clip, but they're televised So now that the public can see it, they start to realize, like, okay, this guy doesn't have any evidence. There's no specific evidence. It's just really trying to go after people and get famous here. And so that's really when he loses his steam and people stop supporting him, and eventually he dies of alcoholism. So, but when people say, oh, it's such McCarthyism, it's just a synonym for saying, like, fear-mongering, all right, and attacking people without evidence. This is kind of a random place to put this last one in here, but Truman, if you think about all this scare going on, there is a lot of racism. We talked about the KKK before. Things like that's not as relevant here. But one thing that Truman does, I guess, to fight this, but it ends up causing a different kind of racism. The executive order here, 9981, desegregates the military. And so it's not until after World War II, right, that the military gets desegregated, because we talked about that in World War II. And that's going to be a big part of his future, Truman's future, is what he believes about civil rights. Okay. So that's the Cold War. And that's not all the Cold War. Fun fact, the Cold War goes until 1991. Because that's when the Soviet Union falls. So that's like pretty recent, right? It was 30 years ago, but still, I'm 30-ish. Okay, but what was the economy like after the war? You can assume, we talked about what it was like during the war. We were kind of a beast, right? Beast mode in that sense. And they're going to have a little slow period for a second, but they're really going to take off. The Taft-Hartley Act is, okay, how do we feel, how does the United States feel about unions during the Cold War? Probably against it, right? Because you think about unions, you think about the workers rising and taking over capitalism, right? So they associate unions with communism. So this Taft-Hartley Act gets passed, even though Truman vetoed it, and basically outlaws unions. And the closed shop, right? That doesn't really outlaw unions. It outlaws the closed shop and takes away from unions all the work that we've gotten to so far. If you look down here, it says, Mr. President vetoed the Hartley-Taft, which is funny, slave labor bill. So they're calling that working conditions slave labor if they can't go on strike and all that stuff. And Employment Act, I'm not spending my time on that. No. All right. Another thing after the war, you're having all these soldiers return home who didn't have jobs before, and it's a lot of young men kind of going back into the workplace, where we talked about blacks migrated for jobs. You've got the Mexicans migrating. You've got women working. So this GI Bill here, this is G.I. Joe. Fun fact. Okay. Government is going to give these soldiers returning access to education and money. And so really it's a lot of these soldiers are going back into education, getting their education, which is going to help the economy, right? It's going to allow them, give them housing. So it's a good stimulus there for the soldiers returning. Okay, well, Mr. Truman has another election here against Dewey. We've talked about Dewey before. And there's actually going to be two other candidates here, Strom Thurmond, and then you're going to get Henry Wallace, which, fun fact, he was vice president with FDR. These people aren't important. Which one have you heard of? Truman, because you don't really hear about people who don't win. But it was actually a really close election. He didn't think he was going to win because if you think about Truman, right, how did he get in presidency in the first place? It's because FDR died. So a lot of people discredit him and for that. But really, if you think about, okay, that's the next point. So Truman, after he wins, decides, okay, I'm gonna have the fair deal. So if you think about the square deal and the New Deal, now you have the fair deal. And this is the interesting thing about this is kind of where the modern Democratic stance, like the Democratic Party today, it kind of starts to get its shape here with Truman. If you know anything about modern Democrats, you're going to see some similarities here. Social Security, public housing, minimum wage goes up. Another one. Healthcare. There you go. National healthcare. If you know anything, even today, and if you listen to election stuff today, that's still a big thought about in the Democratic Party is national healthcare. So we talked about the reshaping of political parties with FDR. Truman's going to kind of solidify that a little bit more now that there's no Great Depression. It's like, what's going to look like now? So fun fact there. It doesn't all get passed because that's how it works, but that is just kind of the beginning. After the war, though, they're definitely going to be in... You want me to start messing up all of your lectures? Do you have any fun physics things to tell us?
Post-war prosperity?
Yeah. The difference between the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb?
Both are pretty bad, pretty explosive.
One is nuclear fission, and one is nuclear...
Fusion.
Yeah, did I just say that?
Yeah.
Which one's more powerful, fission or fusion? You get 5 seconds. We don't have time for this.
Okay. Fission.
Fission?
Yeah.
There you go. So the hydrogen bomb is nuclear fission. Okay. Economic boom took off. What are we talking about? So really from the 50s to the 70s, America is just they're going to go crazy in the economy. Do super well because of the war and how they did. And remember, it didn't really attack the homeland that much other than Hawaii. But then we'll get to the 70s when things change. Okay. Rise of the middle class. People used to make fun of that. They heard this a lot. If you don't know an answer, say rise of the middle class. But what's interesting, if you think about the Great Depression, there's not going to be a lot of people in the middle class, right? You had your rich, and then you had your poor, and then you had a lot of people fall into the poor. Well, now during this post-war, you're going to have 60% of people now go into the middle class. And the middle class is still really big today. So yeah, that's a fun fact. Okay, and then women. So we know what happened with women, Rosie the Riveter in World War II. So we talked a little bit about what happens after the war. A lot of them leave. But in this post-war, because the economy is so good, one kind of area that's going to get a lot bigger is the service industry. So the industry is still big, but it's not going to be as important. The service industry is really going to rise. You have 25% of people working in the service industry. And when I say service, you know what I'm talking about. It's it could be restaurants. It could be anything where you get served, right? So it could be Macy's. I don't know why Macy's came to mind, but what am I trying to say? Clothing industry, perfume. I'm thinking of malls. That's really what I mean. So anyway, things aren't really getting produced. You're being served, and that's a sign that your economy is doing well when there's a lot of service. Because nobody's going out to eat if the economy is not doing well. Okay, this is also going to be the rise. This time period, the rise of the Sun Belt. And here's a picture down here. All the ones kind of in red are the Sun Belt. And people are going to move there. And for a while, people were moving away, right? And they're moving to the north for jobs. But here they're going to move to this area. You've got lower taxes. You've got warmer climate. And now you have jobs. Why are there now more jobs down here? It's not because of agriculture. It's because of, we mentioned this before, the government decides to send a lot of money to the south and to the Sun Belt for industrial things. and factories. They're trying to give the South more momentum, spread it out more. And anyway, so this whole area starts to rise, and now you kind of have the Northeast declining a little bits, and the Rust Belt, the Ohio area, kind of declining, where the rise of the Sun Belt. Okay, and then because people are making more money, but they decide. I'm going to show you some pictures here. Now the suburbs are going to grow, and Newnan is a suburb of Atlanta. So really the rise of Newnan and Peachtree City and things like that are coming out of World War II. And if you think about the car and how that has helped the suburbs, interstates are going to be developed more, and that helps the suburbs. You're going to have shopping malls, and all this stuff now is changing. Has anybody seen Truman? What is this movie called? It's older. Jim Carrey. It's Truman's World, something like that. I don't remember. Anyway, he basically lives in this area where everything is the same. And these are, it kind of comes out of the idea of a Levittown. It's these contractors that started building these neighborhoods that all look the same. Every house looks the same, and you have all these people moving into the suburbs. You've seen that today. I'm sure you've seen neighborhoods where every kind of house looks the same or pretty similar. And that's cheap housing, right? Looks the same, so it's easy to build and easy to do it fast. Those are called Levittowns. Began. One big thing though about the suburbs is who is leaving, and it's largely the white people, which ends up what's happening to the cities is now they get worse education, right? And different things. And if you think about now, like living in Atlanta, right? Like the public schools there struggle. Remember they had that cheating scandal, and now the cities they used to be the place to go, and now people are leaving the cities, and they call it white flight. Fun fact is kind of even a more modern thing. This isn't in your textbook, but if you think about today, what are they trying to do in cities? They're trying to make them like a place for young people to come back and live, right? They're trying to redo cities to where there's more green space, but now that's making the housing for poor people, and where do they have to go? So, okay. Here's the last thing the whole time is now all these people are coming back, all these soldiers, leads to the baby boomers. So now you can officially talk about boomers. But you have a ton of people born. It's like my mom's era. After all these soldiers come back, which is going to create, as the boomers get older, right? And there's all these big group now of people in one age group. It's going to put a stress on colleges. Then it's going to put a stress on, like the thing now that they're worried about is Social Security. When all these people retire, is there enough Social Security to go around? So, baby boomers, boom. Okay, that's it. There you go. That's our post-war, Cold War, post-war. Like I said, I will send you this PowerPoint's online. I will send you a study guide and an email with instructions, and let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk about it live on Wednesday. See you guys.